The California Gold Rush was a pivotal moment in American history, forever altering the nation's trajectory. It sparked a mass migration that reshaped the country's demographics and fueled unprecedented economic growth. Join me as we unearth the fascinating story of how a single discovery at Sutter's Mill ignited a frenzy that would change the course of history forever. As the dust settled on the Mexican-American War, California found itself a newly minted territory of the United States, its future uncertain but ripe with possibility. The year was 1848, and the landscape was dotted with the remnants of the war, abandoned missions, scattered ranches, and the faint outlines of Native American trails that had been trodden for centuries. It was against this backdrop that James W. Marshall, a carpenter and sawmill operator, stumbled upon a discovery that would shatter the tranquility of this vast and sparsely populated land. On January 24, 1848, Marshall's eyes widened as he gazed into the American River, his gaze falling upon a glint of gold peeking out from among the river's smooth stones. The spot was near Sutter's Mill, a sawmill Marshall had been building for Swiss-born businessman John Sutter, who had established himself as a prominent figure in the region. News of the discovery spread like wildfire, though at first it was met with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Sutter, keenly aware of the potential implications, attempted to keep the discovery under wraps, fearing that an influx of outsiders would disrupt his carefully constructed empire. Sutter's concerns were not unfounded. His domain, which he had dubbed Nueva Helvecia, was a sprawling network of ranches, farms, and trading posts, all centered around his fortified settlement in present-day Sacramento. However, as word of the gold discovery began to seep out, the first trickles of prospectors started to arrive, drawn by the promise of easy wealth. These early miners were largely locals, Native Americans, Californians, Mexican-born residents of California, and a smattering of American settlers who had arrived in the region before the war. Their mining efforts were crude but effective, using simple techniques such as panning and sluice boxing to extract gold from the river's gravel and soil. As the weeks passed, the yields were modest but consistent, enough to convince even the most hardened skeptics that Marshall's discovery was genuine. Yet, despite Sutter's best efforts to maintain secrecy, rumors of the gold find began to spread, carried by travelers, traders, and the occasional newspaper article that made its way into the region. The news traveled slowly at first, restricted to the local population and a handful of adventurers who had been drawn to California's untamed wilderness. However, as spring gave way to summer, the trickle of prospectors became a steady stream, and by the time the rainy season arrived in the fall of 1848, it was clear that Sutter's empire was on the brink of collapse. The man who had once been the undisputed master of California's Central Valley now found himself struggling to maintain control as thousands of newcomers poured into the region, each with their own dreams of striking it rich. As the winter of 1848 gave way to the spring of 1849, the trickle of prospectors that had been making their way to California's goldfields began to swell into a tidal wave of humanity. The news of Marshall's discovery had finally reached the eastern United States, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands of would-be miners, later dubbed the 49ers, set out on the arduous journey to California, driven by the promise of easy wealth and a fresh start. They traveled along the Overland Trail, a 2,000-mile route that spanned from Missouri to California, braving treacherous mountain passes, raging rivers, and disease-ridden campsites. But the 49ers were not alone in their quest for gold. As news of the discovery spread throughout the world, Latin American, European, and Chinese immigrants began to arrive in California, drawn by this same promise of riches. Chileans, Peruvians, and Mexicans came by sea, disembarking at the bustling port of San Francisco, while Germans, French, and Italians traveled overland, often bringing with them valuable skills such as engineering and metallurgy. The Chinese, who would eventually become one of the largest immigrant groups in California, arrived in significant numbers, establishing themselves as key players in the mining industry. As the population of California exploded, boomtowns sprang up overnight, catering to the needs of the miners. Sacramento, San Francisco, and Stockton became hubs of activity, with hotels, saloons, and general stores popping up to serve the influx of new arrivals. The demographics of these towns were in a state of constant flux, as people from all over the world came and went, seeking their fortunes in the goldfields. The once sleepy town of San Francisco, for example, saw its population grow from a few hundred to over 20,000 in a matter of months, earning it the nickname the Instant City. The maritime routes played a crucial role in facilitating this mass migration. Ships from all over the world docked at San Francisco's bustling port, disgorging passengers and cargo onto the crowded wharves. The journey by sea was long and arduous, but it was often preferable to the overland route, which could take months to complete. As a result, the port of San Francisco became a melting pot of cultures, with people from all over the world interacting and exchanging ideas in a vibrant and dynamic environment. The impact of this sudden population explosion on California's infrastructure and social fabric was profound. The state's population grew from just 1,000 in 1848 to over 300,000 by the end of 1849, putting an enormous strain on resources such as food, housing, and healthcare. The once pristine landscape was transformed overnight, as mining camps, towns, and cities sprang up, bringing with them pollution, deforestation, and habitat destruction. Despite these challenges, the 49ers and other immigrants persevered, driven by their determination to strike it rich in the Golden State. As the dawn broke over the Sierra Nevada mountains in 1850, the mining camps were already abuzz with activity. The sound of pickaxes striking gravel and the murmur of conversations filled the crisp mountain air as thousands of prospectors set out to stake their claim on the rich placer deposits that had drawn them to California. The techniques used by these miners were largely primitive, yet effective, relying on simple tools such as rocker boxes, long toms, and sluice boxes to separate the gold from the dirt and gravel. A typical day in the diggings began before sunrise, with miners rising from their cramped and often makeshift shelters to start a fire and prepare a meager breakfast. This usually consisted of beans, bacon, and bread, washed down with coffee or tea, which was often made from crude boiled water that had been hauled from nearby streams or rivers. With their bellies full, the miners would then set out to their claims, where they would spend the day panning, digging, and washing gravel in search of the elusive gold. Despite the promise of sudden wealth, life in the mining camps was harsh and unforgiving. Shelter was often little more than a canvas tent or a rough-hewn cabin, offering scant protection from the elements. Food was scarce and expensive, with staples like flour, sugar, and salt often commanding exorbitant prices due to the difficulty of transporting them to the remote mining camps. Disease was also rampant, with cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever sweeping through the camps with deadly regularity, as poor sanitation and inadequate medical care took their toll on the miners. Yet, despite these challenges, the miners persevered, driven by the promise of riches and a better life. They were a mobile and restless population, always on the move in search of the next big strike or a fresh opportunity to make their fortunes. Many miners would spend weeks or even months working a single claim, only to abandon it and move on to another location when the gold began to play out. This constant mobility meant that mining camps were often little more than temporary settlements, springing up overnight and disappearing just as quickly when the gold was exhausted. As the year 1850 wore on, the placer deposits in the Sierra Nevada mountains began to show signs of exhaustion, with many of the easily accessible areas having been thoroughly worked over. In response, miners began to turn their attention to more challenging and remote locations, such as the American River's North Fork, where the gold was often buried beneath layers of gravel and dirt that required more sophisticated techniques to extract. The introduction of hydraulic mining, which used high-pressure jets of water to wash away entire hillsides and reveal the hidden gold deposits, marked a significant turning point in the development of the California goldfields. By 1851, the character of the mining camps was beginning to change as the first wave of prospectors gave way to a more settled and established population. Merchants and traders began to arrive in greater numbers, setting up stores and supply depots to cater to the needs of the miners. The introduction of new technologies, such as the steam-powered pump, also helped to facilitate the extraction of gold from more remote and inaccessible locations. As the mining industry continued to evolve and mature, the miners themselves became increasingly specialized, with some focusing on specific techniques or types of deposits, while others turned their attention to related pursuits such as farming, ranching, or trade. As the mining industry continued to mature, the boomtowns that sprouted up around the diggings became notorious for their lawlessness and decadence. In 1851, the town of Jackson, situated in the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains, was a prime example of this phenomenon. Its main street was lined with saloons, gaming halls, and brothels, catering to the desires of the predominantly male population. Gambling and alcohol became integral parts of the mining culture, with many miners spending their hard-earned gold dust on whiskey, cards, and women. The informal economies that emerged in these boomtowns were often more lucrative than the formal ones. Women, who were scarce in the mining camps, played a crucial role in this economy, offering services such as laundry, cooking, and prostitution to the miners. In Jackson, for instance, a woman could earn up to $100 per month doing laundry, a small fortune considering that a skilled miner might earn only $50 per month. However, this gender imbalance also led to a thriving trade in women's services, with some entrepreneurs even importing women from as far away as San Francisco and Sacramento to work in the boomtowns. The lack of formal law enforcement in these towns meant that justice was often meted out through vigilante means. Miners' courts, which were essentially makeshift tribunals composed of local miners, would convene to try cases of theft, assault, and murder. These courts were notorious for their harsh punishments, with sentences ranging from flogging to hanging. In 1852, a group of miners in the town of Amador City even lynched a man accused of stealing a horse, highlighting the brutal nature of frontier justice. Crime was rampant in these boomtowns, with thieves, con artists, and claim jumpers preying on unsuspecting miners. To combat this, many towns established their own systems of community norms and punishments. In the town of Sutter Creek, for example, a group of miners formed a vigilance committee to deal with petty crime and disorderly conduct. This committee would often mete out punishments such as fines, flogging, or even banishment from the town. The environmental strain on the rivers and settlements was also becoming increasingly apparent by 1852. The widespread use of hydraulic mining had led to massive deforestation and soil erosion, causing rivers to become choked with sediment and debris. In the American River, for instance, the water level had dropped significantly due to the diversion of water for mining purposes, affecting not only the miners, but also the local wildlife. The settlements themselves were often little more than ramshackle collections of tents and cabins, with inadequate sanitation and waste disposal, leading to the spread of diseases such as cholera and dysentery. As California entered its early years as a U.S. state, the debates over slavery and free labor continued to simmer. In 1853, the California state legislature passed a law that prohibited the introduction of new slaves into the state, but allowed existing slave owners to keep their property. This compromise reflected the divided opinions among Californians, with some advocating for the abolition of slavery and others pushing for its expansion. The issue remained contentious, with many seeing it as a threat to the state's economic development and social stability. Meanwhile, anti-immigrant sentiment began to rise, particularly against Chinese and Latin American miners. In 1852, the California state legislature had passed the foreign miners tax, which imposed a monthly fee of $3 on all foreign miners. This tax was designed to discourage foreign competition and protect the interests of American miners. However, it had the opposite effect, as many foreign miners refused to pay the tax or were forced out of business. The tax also led to increased tensions between American and foreign miners, with violent confrontations becoming more common. As the mining industry continued to consolidate, a small group of powerful businessmen and politicians began to dominate the state's economy and politics. Men like Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, who would later become known as the Big Four, amassed enormous wealth and influence through their control of the railroad, banking, and mining industries. They used their power to shape state policies and laws to their advantage, often at the expense of smaller miners and foreign workers. In 1854, the California state legislature passed a law that allowed for the formation of corporations, which further consolidated power in the hands of a few wealthy individuals. This led to the creation of large mining companies, which were able to exploit the state's resources on a massive scale. The use of hydraulic mining, which had been introduced in the early 1850s, became more widespread, leading to devastating environmental consequences and displacement of small miners. The racial conflicts that had been simmering beneath the surface of California society finally boiled over in 1855. In May of that year, a group of American miners attacked a Chinese mining camp in Calaveras County, killing several men and destroying their property. The incident sparked a wave of anti-Chinese violence across the state, with many Chinese miners being forced to flee for their lives. The California state legislature responded by passing a series of laws that restricted the rights of Chinese immigrants, including a ban on their testimony in court and a prohibition on their ownership of land. As the anti-Chinese violence subsided, a new era of mining emerged in California, marked by the rise of hydraulic and industrial mining. The introduction of more advanced technologies, such as the hydraulic giant, allowed companies to extract gold and other minerals on a larger scale, rendering individual prospectors increasingly obsolete. By 1856, the number of independent miners had begun to decline, as many were forced to sell their claims to larger corporations or abandon their pursuits altogether. One notable example of this shift was the emergence of the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company, which began operations in 1856 and quickly became one of the largest hydraulic mining companies in the state. The company's use of advanced technologies, such as giant nozzles and sluice boxes, allowed it to extract vast amounts of gold from the Sierra Nevada foothills, but also led to significant environmental degradation and conflicts with local communities. As corporate mining expanded, legal battles over land and water rights intensified. In 1858, the California Supreme Court ruled in the case of Irwin v. Phillips, establishing that a miner's right to use water was not absolute and could be limited by the needs of other users, such as farmers and municipalities. This decision set a precedent for future conflicts between miners, farmers, and other stakeholders over access to water resources. The rise of corporate mining also led to significant changes in the state's economy and politics. By the early 1860s, companies like the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company had begun to dominate the mining industry, and their influence extended into the state legislature and beyond. In 1862, the California state legislature passed a law that allowed corporations to hold land and water rights, further solidifying their grip on the industry. As the Civil War drew to a close, the mining industry in California continued to evolve, with a growing focus on industrial-scale extraction of minerals such as copper, silver, and quartz. The introduction of new technologies, such as the steam shovel and the railroad, facilitated the growth of large-scale mining operations and transformed the state's economy. By the late 1860s, the individual prospector had all but disappeared from the California mining scene, replaced by large corporations and industrial-scale operations. The once thriving mining camps were now largely abandoned, and the state's population had begun to shift towards urban centers like San Francisco and Sacramento. In 1872, the federal government passed the General Mining Act, which allowed citizens to stake claims on public land and extract minerals without paying royalties to the government. While this law was intended to promote mining and settle the West, it ultimately benefited large corporations at the expense of individual miners and local communities. As the mining industry continued to consolidate and industrialize, the long-term economic transformation of the West became increasingly apparent. The growth of corporate mining had created new opportunities for investment and employment, but also led to significant environmental degradation and social inequality. By 1873, the California mining industry had become a shadow of its former self, with many of the state's most famous mining camps reduced to ghost towns. The California Gold Rush was a pivotal event in American history, one that sparked a mass migration of people to the West Coast, transformed the nation's economy, and forever changed the landscape of the region. As we reflect on the stories of the prospectors, the entrepreneurs, and the communities that were shaped by this era, we are reminded that the true wealth of the gold rush was not just in the gold itself, but in the resilience, determination, and ingenuity of the people who dared to dream big. The California Gold Rush may have ended, but its legacy lives on, a testament to the power of human ambition and the enduring spirit of exploration and discovery that has always defined us as a nation. As we close this chapter on the Golden State's most iconic era, we are left with a profound appreciation for the complexities and challenges of the past, and a deeper understanding of how they have shaped the world we live in today. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. Until we meet again, I'm Herodotus, reminding you that history isn't just a story, it's our story. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that to understand the present, we must first understand the past.